A little while ago, I got to review the DK-2001 Pro, and I found that it had made some big improvements in every meaningful way over the original DK-2001. But then I also got this, the DK-2001, which, unbeknownst to me at the time, is actually the direct technological upgrade to the original DK-2001. So, just how much of an improvement are we getting over the 3001? Well, as it turns out, quite a bit more than what I had anticipated. If you want a bit more of a detailed look into the design of the DK-2001, then check out the link in the description, which will take you to the full written review. Essentially, the design is closely related to the original 3001's technical engineering, driver configuration, and sound signature, but it has the benefit of the more ergonomic redesign of the new 3001 Pro. The housing itself is very similar to the 3001 Pro, whereby extra attention was given to reduce the amount of sharp angles and other protrusions, all in the effort of making these very comfortable, and they definitely succeeded. The 2001 feels well made, and you can tell that it's a premium product which has undergone strict quality control measures. Even the cable, which might not be the most premium out there, still feels to be of very good quality. It's soft enough to minimize kinks and other tangles, but the most impressive part of the design can be found at the plug. It features the new modular connector, but only the 3.5mm single-ended adapter is included in the box. Overall, the DK-2001 looks good, feels good, and all of the design improvements that Dunu have employed along with that great modular plug system means that this IEM packs quite a punch. But the build and aesthetic appeal is only half the story. Does it sound as good as it looks? Included in the box are a couple of different types of ear tips, which can alter the sound signature a little bit here and there. The standard tips, which are already installed, are of an orange color, and the graph we're getting from these indicate that the DK-2001 has an overall warm signature, as the lower and mid-bass regions are more elevated than the rest of the response, with only one elevated treble spike in that 4 to 5 kHz region. This spike tends to give it a seemingly more V-shaped signature than perhaps something like the more premium DK-2001 Pro, but it's still not something I would call V-shaped per se. It does come across noticeably warm and perhaps just a little bloated in the bass. Switching over to the grey tips, there really doesn't seem to be much of a difference, and not one that I could reliably pinpoint when listening to them anyways. The final set of silicon tips included are the grey ones with a red stem. These tips presented a more noticeable difference, but it's mainly in that upper treble region. So if for whatever reason you felt that it doesn't have quite enough sparkle in the upper registers, then these tips might just be the little band-aid you're looking for. Then there are also some foam tips included, and these give a response which is very similar to the response of the previous silicon tips, albeit with an added slight dip in the 2 to 4 kHz region. Okay, then we get into some aftermarket tips, with the first being the spin fits. As is usually the case with these tips, they tend to mainly boost those upper treble frequencies, which can make the 2001 sound a bit more V-shaped than the other tips we've had a look at. Then there are also the Jvc Spiral Dot tips. These tips seem to present pretty much an identical signature to some of the other included tips. At this stage, I'd say that between these tips and both the orange and the grey included tips, whichever you pick will have more to do with whichever you think looks better, as well as whichever you find more comfortable. Whilst sticking with the Spiral Dot tips, let's take a look at a few comparisons to some of Dunu's other IEMs. Compared to the original 3001, the bass response is essentially identical, but the rest of the response shows a number of drastic differences. A few of the peaks occur in the same locations, but at very different levels. The 2001 just seems much better controlled, with the biggest difference lying in that upper treble region. When listening to these back to back, I can confirm that these models do have some notable similarities, but the 2001 just sounds so much more natural than the 3001. There are instances where that extra shimmer on the 3001 can be pretty impressive, but ultimately it's something I also find to be rather fatiguing during longer listening sessions. What I really like is how that coherency of the 3001 is also carried over to the 2001, which is something I also noted in my review of the 3001 Pro. Speaking of which, the response graph of the DK-2001 Pro is rather telling as to how the 2001 sits neatly between it and the original 3001. In comparison, the 2001 does have a stronger bass presence, but it's ultimately that treble response which is much more closely related to the 3001 Pro than the original 3001. And this is where it becomes apparent that the 2001 seems to be more of a budget 3001 Pro. So I think Dunu did a really good job with the 2001 sound, as that slight V-shaped signature will likely be more mass appealing than the perhaps more technically accurate but arguably less exciting signature of the 3001 Pro. One similarity in particular I found between the 2001 and the 3001 Pro is with reference to how they handle electric guitars, whereby that crunch and bite from the distortion is portrayed with a real sense of authority and separation. Bass impacts sound distinct, and whilst the upper treble might not be very prominent, shimmers from cymbals are still very audible and come across detailed and in a more natural manner. It's not quite as well controlled and natural as you'd find on the 3001 Pro, but I think it's still very good nonetheless. So for a price tag of $300, I think Dunu has hit a bit of a sweet spot with the DK-2001. Essentially what you are getting is somewhat of a baby DK-3001 Pro. It is a pity that you don't also get any extra adapters in the box, but at least the option is there to simply purchase an adapter if you want to use the 2001 with a balanced output, rather than having to purchase and swap an entirely new cable. So, in terms of both technical design and function as well as sound quality, the 2001 feels like an evolution of the original DK-3001, and yet it costs nearly $200 less than the original 3001 and subsequent 3001 Pro. Objectively, no, it's not quite as good as the 3001 Pro, but the sound signature of the Pro isn't going to be for everyone either. The more neutral bass response will leave bass lovers a bit disappointed, whereas the comparatively more V-shaped signature of the 2001 will likely appeal to the taste of a much wider audience. Alright, well that's all we have for this review. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed it, hit that like button and do consider subscribing. That's all from me for now, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers!